In the spring of 1987, Harlan County, Kentucky recorded its third consecutive year of rainfall below 9 inches. The soil cracked open like old leather left too long in the sun. Wells went dry. Creeks pulled back from their banks and left behind nothing but pale rock and dried mud laced with old root. The county extension office reported that 42% of small farms had failed to break even that season, and 17 of them had already surrendered their deeds to the First National Bank of Harlan by the time the locust trees shed their last leaves in November. It was the kind of slow, grinding disaster that didn't make the evening news but lived permanently in the bones of the people who survived it. Edna Calloway was 53 years old that autumn, and she was standing at the kitchen window of a farmhouse that had belonged to her husband's family since 1921 when the bank's letter arrived. She had flour on her hands and a dish towel thrown over one shoulder and the kind of tired in her eyes that doesn't come from one bad night of sleep but from years of carrying things that were never meant for one person alone. The letter was thin. Single page. She read it twice, set it on the table next to the salt shaker, and went back to the biscuits she was making. Her husband Roy had been dead 14 months. He died the way a lot of farm men die, not dramatically, not in one big moment, but slowly, from years of diesel fumes and lifting and heat and cold and the kind of stress that sits in the chest like a stone you forget is there until it finally decides to move. His heart gave out on a Tuesday in September while he was walking between the barn and the equipment shed. The neighbor boy found him face down in the Johnson grass at the edge of the south field. He was 61 years old, and the farm he left behind had a lien on the tractor, a second mortgage on the house, and a rocky hillside parcel of 40 acres up on Breeden Ridge that nobody in the family had ever done anything with except use it occasionally to let the cows wander. Roy had called that hill worthless every time he looked at it. Nothing but rocks and poor dirt, he used to say, standing at the fence line with his thumbs hooked in his overall straps, squinting up at the slope with the expression of a man personally offended by geography. My daddy bought that piece in 1953 and I never knew why. You can't row crop it. Can't hay it proper. Cows won't even graze the top half. Edna had listened to this speech more times than she could count. She never argued. The letter from First National said that the farm's outstanding debt, combined with the missed mortgage payment from August and the unpaid balance on the equipment loan, had placed the property in a preliminary default status. A representative would be available to discuss options. The tone of it was polite in the way that a locked door is polite. Her daughter called that evening from Louisville. "Mama, you need to sell the Ridge parcel. That'll get you out from under the equipment loan at least. Maybe Darrell Combs would take it. He's been buying up pieces out that way. Darrell Combs wants it for hunting land." "Well, so what? Land is land." "Land is not land," Edna said quietly, and her daughter went silent for a moment because she recognized that tone, the one that came up from somewhere deep in her mother and didn't argue and didn't explain itself. "Mama, the bank isn't going to wait forever." "I know that, sweetheart. And you can't farm all that yourself. You're 53 years old." "I know how old I am." Her son-in-law got on the phone briefly to explain, in the careful voice of a man who sells insurance and believes spreadsheets tell the whole truth, that the numbers simply didn't work. Edna thanked him and said goodnight and washed her dinner plate and sat at the kitchen table for a long time with a cup of coffee that went cold in her hands. She was thinking about olive trees. It sounds like the kind of thing a person thinks when grief has made them a little loose in the head, and Edna knew that was how it would sound to everyone else, which is why she didn't say it out loud to anyone for months. But the thought had been with her longer than grief. It had been with her since a trip she and Roy had taken in 1974 to visit a cousin of his who'd settled in California's Central Valley, and on the drive back they had passed through the hill country of Northern California where the slopes were terraced and dry and rocky and old olive trees stood in long silver-green rows, their trunks twisted like old rope, their roots pushed down into the same kind of thin, fast-draining, stony hillside soil that Roy always cursed on Breeden Ridge. She had sat in the passenger seat of that truck staring out at those trees and felt something click in her chest like a key turning. Roy had been asleep. She hadn't said anything. She went to the county library in early November and checked out everything they had on olive cultivation, which was not much, 2 general books on Mediterranean agriculture and 1 USDA pamphlet on experimental orchard crops in non-traditional climates. She wrote letters to the extension offices at the University of Tennessee and Kentucky State University. She wrote to the Agricultural Department at North Carolina State. She got one reply, from a young extension agent at Tennessee named Marcus Webb, who wrote back a cautious but genuine letter saying that while commercial olive production had not been established in the Mid-South Appalachian region, there were varieties, particularly the Arbequina and the Koroniki, that had demonstrated cold hardiness into the mid-teens Fahrenheit in trial plantings, and that the well-drained rocky slopes of the Cumberland Plateau were not, at least in theory, entirely inhospitable. He also wrote, "I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Calloway, that this would be a significant gamble. Trees take years to mature. The first meaningful harvest wouldn't come for 5 to 7 years at minimum. I would be happy to speak with you further, but I would not want to encourage something that might cost you your farm." She folded that letter and kept it in her apron pocket for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, she sold the old combine to a man in Bledsoe County for enough to cover the August mortgage payment and buy another month's piece from the bank. She sold Roy's second truck. She took in sewing from 3 women in town and started baking pies for the diner on Route 119, which paid 40 cents a pie over cost. She was not complaining. She was calculating. In December, she drove to Tennessee and sat in Marcus Webb's office in Knoxville for 2 hours. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 30, with the uncomfortable posture of a man who wasn't sure how to tell an older woman that her idea was either brave or foolish and couldn't quite decide which. He had graphs and climate charts spread across his desk. He walked her through cold hardiness zones and frost pocket topography and soil pH and water table access and the minimum acreage required to make pressing economically viable. He was thorough and honest and a little apologetic. "The honest answer is, nobody's done this in your county," he said. "Maybe in your whole region. You'd essentially be a trial planting." "I know," Edna said. "And the financial window is very tight. You'd need to keep the land producing something else while the trees establish. Probably a cover crop, maybe some grazing on the lower sections. And you'd need to carry the debt for the trees themselves for several years before you saw any return." "I know that too." He looked at her Edna looked out his office window at the gray December sky for a moment. "I saw the land in California," she said. "And I felt something familiar about it. The rocky slope and the thin soil and the way the light sits on it in the afternoon. I thought, if those trees grow there, and the land looks like mine, then maybe they'd grow here too." "That's not the worst reasoning I've heard," he said. And then he smiled, and she knew she had an ally. She went home and did the math 17 different ways over Christmas. She sat at Roy's old desk in the corner of the living room with his ledger books open beside her and a yellow legal pad covered in her own careful numbers. She slept badly. She prayed some, not the formal church-going kind of prayer but the quiet kind that happens in the dark when you're too tired to be anything but honest. She thought about her children's voices on the phone, concerned and certain. She thought about Darrell Combs and his hunting camps and the way the land would go quiet and purposeless under people who didn't know what it could hold. In January 1988, she called Marcus Webb and told him she was going forward. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "All right. Let's figure out how." He read through her folder slowly. He looked up twice without saying anything. Then he took off his glasses and pressed the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I've seen a lot of farm restructure proposals in this chair. I can say honestly I've never seen one involving olive trees." "I imagine not. Olives are a Mediterranean crop. You're in eastern Kentucky. The trees don't know where they are," she said. "The soil and the drainage do." He looked at her for a moment over his glasses. "You've had this assessed?" "I've had it analyzed by the University of Tennessee's Agricultural Extension. The documents are there." He read a while longer. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her face calm in the way of women who have waited out hard seasons before and understand that panic is a luxury they cannot afford. In the end, Gerald Pierce did something that surprised both of them. He didn't say yes, not exactly, but he called his branch manager in, and the two of them sat with Edna's folder for another hour, and they agreed to a restructured 18-month forbearance on the equipment debt in exchange for a lien on the ridge parcel, with a review at the end of the forbearance period. It wasn't a miracle. It was barely a handshake. But it was enough room to plant. That spring, Edna ordered 300 Arbequina trees from a nursery in California that Marcus Webb had found, bare rootstock shipped in wooden crates that arrived at the Harlan Freight Depot on a cold morning in late March, smelling of damp sawdust and something faintly green. She drove them home in the bed of the pickup with her neighbor Cleet Bevins riding along to help, a retired tobacco farmer who was the kind of man who said very little but showed up reliably, which Edna had come to understand was its own form of eloquence. Cleet looked at the crates and then looked at the hill when they pulled up to the fence line. "Olive trees," he said. Yes. He considered this. In Kentucky. On that hillside specifically. The drainage is right and the slopes south-facing. He nodded slowly, the way men like Cleet nod when they're reserving judgment. "Want me to help you clear the rocks?" "I'd be grateful, Cleet." They spent 6 weeks preparing the hillside. It was brutal work, the kind that leaves you unable to fully extend your arms in the morning, pulling stones, busting hardpan, amending the soil in the planting holes with sand and compost while leaving the native rock structure mostly intact because the drainage was, as she'd suspected, exactly what she needed. Marcus Webb drove up from Knoxville twice during that period, walking the rows she'd staked, checking the grade and the spacing, getting his boots muddy and not complaining about it. She fed him biscuits and soup both times and sent him home with a jar of honey from her 2 remaining hives. The neighbors talked, of course. That was inevitable. Small towns have their own kind of weather system, and gossip moves through them the way cold fronts move through a valley, fast, low to the ground, hard to outrun. The word around Harlan was that Edna Calloway had lost her mind after Roy died and was wasting the rest of her farm trying to grow something that had no business in Kentucky. Darrell Combs told people at the feed store that he'd be buying that rich parcel inside of 3 years at a tax auction. The preacher's wife said, gently, that sometimes grief makes people do things that seem purposeful but are really just a way of not feeling. Even Edna's daughter, who loved her mother without question, had a habit of calling on Sunday afternoons with a careful voice and asking how things were going up on the hill, with a particular emphasis on things that made clear she was listening for signs of retreat. Edna planted the last tree on a Friday in late May, the air warm and smelling of honeysuckle from the fence line below. She pressed the earth around the roots with both hands. She stood up slowly, arching her back, and looked at the 300 small trees arranged in their rows across the hillside, nothing but thin green sticks with a few tentative leaves, fragile-looking as candles. Roy would have shaken his head. She could hear it. She walked back down the hill to make supper. The summer of 1988 was dry. Not as catastrophic as the years before, but dry enough. She carried water to the young trees twice a week in the worst of it, buckets in both hands, climbing the slope in the early morning heat with the dogs following her up and back in slow patient arcs. Her hands blistered and healed and blistered again. She lost 11 trees in July to a combination of heat stress and what Marcus Webb identified over the phone as a fungal root issue, almost certainly from overwatering in the establishment phase she had aired, briefly, on the side of too much kindness. She pulled those trees, treated the soil, and left the spaces empty. She could not afford to replace them that season. She worked the lower fields in the traditional way, growing a modest hay crop on the valley portion of the farm that she sold to a cattle operation down the road, and tended a large kitchen garden that fed her through the summer and into fall. She canned everything she could. She mended her own clothes. She drove the old tractor herself, slowly, learning its particular reluctances and moods the way you learn an old person's habits, with patience and a willingness to adjust. In September, Marcus Webb sent her a paper published by an agricultural research station in Texas documenting a small olive trial planting in the hill country, rocky calcareous soil, thin and fast draining, north of San Antonio, where Arbequina trees had survived 3 winters including one that dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. She read it sitting in the kitchen after supper with the lamp on and the dogs breathing slowly on the linoleum at her feet, and something that was not quite hope but was in the same neighborhood moved quietly through her chest. The second year the trees put on real growth. You could see it if you walked the rows in April, the new silver-green leaves pushing out from every branch tip, the trunks thickening almost imperceptibly but enough. They had the look of things settling in, the way a person looks when they've decided they're going to stay somewhere and have started arranging their life accordingly. She replaced the 11 dead trees in early spring with younger stock from a nursery Marcus had located in Georgia. She pruned the established trees according to the guidelines he'd sent, a discipline that felt counterintuitive, cutting back what was growing, but which she understood intellectually and followed with careful hands. Clete Bevins came up the hill every few weeks and walked the rows with her without being asked. He never said much. But she noticed he started reading about olive trees. Once she found a page torn from a farming magazine on her kitchen table when she came inside from the garden, folded open to an article about olive cultivation in North Carolina. She never asked him about it and he never mentioned it, and that was fine. The third winter was the test. February of 1991 brought a hard freeze that dropped to 17 degrees for 4 consecutive nights. Edna sat in the kitchen those nights and listened to the cold work on the house, the walls ticking, the window glass fogging at the edges. She did not go up to the hill to check during the freeze because there was nothing she could do. She understood this about farming in a way that younger people or outside people never quite grasped, that there is a moment in every season where you have done everything you can do, and the land and the weather will settle things between them, and you are not a participant in that negotiation. You are just a person who waits. She prayed again in the dark, the honest kind. When the freeze broke, she went up the hill on a gray morning with the ground hard under her boots. It was in all but 9 trees. 9 had died down to the graft union, and 3 of those recovered even from there. 6 were lost. She marked them with orange flagging tape and walked the rest of the rows and felt the quiet satisfaction of a gamble that had not yet failed. She called Marcus from the kitchen when she got back. "Most of them made it," she said. "I was hoping you'd call," he said. "I've been thinking about your trees all week. You and me both. That's a remarkable result for 17 degrees, Edna. Honestly. Those are tough little trees." "They're the right trees for the right ground," she said. "That's all." The years settled into a rhythm. Not easy. Farming is never easy, and farming something new in a place that doesn't yet know how to support it is its own specific kind of hard, but a rhythm nonetheless. She learned the trees the way you learn a language, by living in its country, through constant exposure and small mistakes and the gradual arrival of understanding that comes from showing up every day. She learned that they wanted less water than she instinctively wanted to give them. She learned that they rewarded the pruning and punished neglect. She learned the particular look of leaves that were stressed versus healthy, the subtle difference in silver on a windy day that meant things were right. She also learned patience at a depth she hadn't known she needed. Her son-in-law stopped calling to discuss the financials after the first restructure review, at which she had presented Gerald Pierce with 2 years of expense records and a progress report from Marcus Webb and a photograph of the hillside taken from the fence line below that showed 285 young olive trees in their silver rows against the blue Kentucky sky. Pierce had looked at the photograph for a long moment and then approved another year of the arrangement. He had done this with the expression of a man who was beginning, reluctantly, to revise a previous conclusion. Darrell Combs bought his hunting land 2 counties over. He stopped mentioning the rich parcel at the feed store. In 1993, the trees flowered for the first time. It happened in May, the small cream-white blossoms appearing in clusters along the branches, so delicate and ordinary-looking that you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. But Edna was always paying attention. She saw them on a morning walk and stood at the end of a row for a long time, not moving. The bees from her hives came to work them, and the sound of the bees on that hillside that spring, the low sustained hum of them in the flowering trees on the south-facing slope in the morning light, was one of the most beautiful things she had ever heard. She went home and called Marcus Webb. "They're blooming," she said. She heard him exhale. "First time?" "Yes." "Edna." There was something in his voice that she recognized because she felt it too. "That's 5 years. Right on time." "Right on time," she agreed. That year's flowers set some fruit, not much. The trees were still young and establishing, and the fruit was small and unevenly distributed. But it was there. Small dark olives, hard and deeply bitter and absolutely real, hanging in the rows of the hillside that Roy Calloway had called worthless in all the years he'd been alive to say so. She picked a handful and held them in her palm. She thought about Roy the way she thought about him most days, not with the sharp edge of early grief but with the complicated tenderness of long acquaintance. She had loved him, fully and for a long time, and he had been wrong about this one thing, and she held both of those facts without needing to choose between them. She put the first real harvest came in the fall of 1995, 8 years after she'd gotten the letter from the bank, 7 years after she'd driven to Knoxville to sit in a young extension agent's office with her hands folded and her back straight. The trees were mature enough now, most of them, and the summer had been good, warm days and cool nights and enough rain without too much, and the fruit set was heavy in a way that she had not seen before, the branches bowing slightly under their own weight in the September light. She hired 3 young men from town to help with the harvest, the Perkins brothers, who worked every harvest season in the county and were strong and reliable and accustomed to hard days. She also had Cleet, of course, who showed up at 6 in the morning on the first day of picking with a thermos of coffee and 2 pairs of work gloves and did not say a word about the fact that he had been watching this hillside fill in with trees for 7 years without ever once calling it anything but her business. They harvested by hand, spreading tarps beneath the branches and raking the fruit down with long-toothed combs the way it had been done in the Mediterranean for 3,000 years, the olives pattering down onto the tarps in a sound like slow rain, filling crate after crate. The work was good work. The kind that is hard on the body but clean in the mind. They picked from sunrise until the light failed them, and at noon Edna brought food up the hill, sandwiches and cold tea and slices of apple cake, and they sat in the rows eating together with the harvest around them and the September sky overhead, wide and pale and still. By the end of the week they had filled 62 wooden crates. She had arranged with a small batch olive oil press in North Carolina, a family operation run by a Greek-American family named Stavros who had been cautiously interested in her project for 2 years and had agreed to process her first run. The crates went into the truck, carefully padded with clean burlap, and she drove them herself over 2 days to the Stavros press in the foothills outside Asheville. Dmitri Stavros, who was 64 and had been pressing olives since his father brought him to the mill at the age of 8, walked around her crates for a while without saying anything, picking up individual olives and looking at them, pressing one between his fingers, smelling his hand. "You grew these in Kentucky," he said. "On a rocky hillside in Harlan County." He nodded slowly, still looking at the olives. "They're small," he said. "Arbequina always is. But the color is good. They didn't get too ripe." He looked at her. "How long did you pick?" "1 week." "Good. That's right." He looked at the crates again. "We'll see what the oil is like. I can't promise you anything." "I'm not asking for promises," she said. He smiled at that, a small one. "Come back in 2 days." She drove back to Harlan, slept 2 nights in her own bed, and drove back to Asheville. Dmitri Stavros met her at the door of the press building and handed her a small clean glass containing a tablespoon of oil, pale gold with the faintest green tinge, still warm from the press. "Taste it," he said. She did. She held it on her tongue and breathed through her nose the way he'd told her to, and the oil opened on her palate in a long slow progression, grassy first, then something fruity and low, then a back of the throat pepper that hit clean and real and true. She looked at him. His expression had shifted. He was watching her with the careful attention of a craftsman evaluating another craftsman's work. "It's good," he said. "Better than I expected. The fruit had real character. Your soil is contributing something." He paused. "I'd be interested in processing." She drove home through the mountains with 62 crates of pressed oil in stainless steel containers in the back of the truck, and somewhere on the 2-lane road above Cumberland Gap she pulled over and sat with the engine running and looked out at the ridgeline going orange and red in the late afternoon light and let herself feel, for a few minutes, all of it, the 8 years of it, the loneliness of the first winters, the blistered hands and the dead trees and the freeze and Roy's voice in her head calling the hill worthless, and Gerald Pierce's careful frown and the library books and Marcus Webb's cautious letter and the 300 bare root sticks she had pressed into the ground herself with her own hands and asked to become something, not knowing then if they could. She let herself feel all of it, and then she pulled back onto the road and drove home. The oil sold. That was the simple and slightly astonishing fact that winter. She had labeled it herself, plain paper labels with clean lettering, Breeden Ridge Olive Oil, Harlan County, Kentucky, and taken it to the natural food store in Harlan, to the small grocery in Benham, to a specialty shop in Middlesboro whose owner looked at her with profound skepticism until she offered a taste on a piece of bread. She also sent bottles to Marcus Webb and to the agricultural departments at Tennessee and Kentucky State, and she sent 3 bottles to Gerald Pierce at First National with a handwritten note. Pierce called her 2 days later. "I've been in this bank for 22 years, he said. "I've never received a gift like this." "It's not exactly a gift," she said. "Think of it as a demonstration." He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Calloway, I want you to know, and I don't say this often, that I have been watching what you've done on that hill with considerable respect." "Thank you, Gerald. You were right. And I was very conservative in my assessment." "You were doing your job," she said. "I don't hold it against you." By spring of 1996 she had a waiting list for bottles at the Middlesbrough shop, and a restaurant in Lexington that a friend of Marcus Webb's had contacted after reading a small piece in the state agricultural newsletter had ordered a case for their kitchen and mentioned it on their menu. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon and it was a food writer from a Knoxville magazine who had heard about a woman in Harlan County growing olive trees on a rocky hillside and wanted to drive up and see it. Edna said yes. The writer came on a gray March morning when the trees were still bare but beginning to show the first pale suggestion of new growth. She was young, maybe 28, from the city, wearing good boots that were going to get muddy, and she had a notebook and a camera and the kind of curious, open face that Edna found immediately trustworthy. They walked the rows together for 2 hours. Edna talked and the writer wrote and asked questions that were thoughtful and not condescending. The piece ran in April under the title A Hillside in Harlan, and it was the kind of writing that gets the land right, the sound of it and the smell of it and the specific quality of the light on the slope in the morning. It described the trees accurately, the oil honestly, and Edna Calloway without sentimentality but with real attention. The phone did not stop ringing for 2 weeks. Cleet Bevins came by on the Friday after the article appeared, which was typical of Cleet, not rushing, not making a fuss, arriving when the immediate commotion had died down enough that a person could think. He sat at her kitchen table and she put coffee in front of him and they were quiet together for a while in the way of people who have known each other long enough that silence is a form of conversation. "I read the article," he said finally. She got the hill right. The way it looks. I thought so too." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Roy would have been surprised," he said. It was the first time either of them had said Roy's name in the context of the trees, and it sat in the kitchen between them honestly, without sentimentality or sharpness. "He might have come around," Edna said. "Given time." "He might have," Cleet agreed. "He was stubborn, Roy, but he wasn't a fool." "Stubborn and fool aren't always the same thing." "No," she said. "They're not." Her daughter came in June that year with her husband and the 2 grandchildren, and on the first morning of the visit Edna took all of them up the hill in the early light before the heat of the day. The grandchildren, 8 and 10, city kids who found the farm alternately magical and boring depending on the hour, ran between the rows with their arms out, touching the leaves, and her daughter walked beside her quietly, looking at the trees, the real grown weight of them now, the silver green of the leaves catching the morning light. "Mama," her daughter said after a while. She stopped walking. "I'm sorry." "For what, sweetheart?" "For not believing in it. For pushing you to sell." Edna looked at her daughter's face, which was Roy's face in the feminine, the same jaw and eyes, and felt the particular tenderness of that resemblance. "You were scared for me," she said. "That's not the same as not believing. I said some things on the phone." "You said things a worried daughter." Her daughter looked at the trees again. "How did you know? How did you know it would work?" Edna thought about the honest answer for a moment. "I didn't know," she said. "I knew the land. I knew what the hill felt like under my feet and what the drainage was and what the slope was, and I knew what I'd seen in California. And I knew that sometimes you have to make a decision based on what you understand even when you can't prove it to anybody else." She paused. "I also knew that if I sold it to Darrell Combs I'd never stop wondering." "Come on," Edna said, and started up the hill. By the harvest of 1997, the Breeden Ridge operation had expanded. Marcus had stood at the podium in front of 200 extension agents and academics and farmers and said, "I want to tell you about a woman in Harlan County, Kentucky, who planted 300 olive trees on a rocky hillside that everyone told her was worthless, and I want to tell you what she understood about that land that the rest of us didn't." And then he'd told them. Edna had not been at the conference. She'd been at home, on the hill, walking the rows the way she did every morning, touching the trees, reading the light, listening to what the land was saying in the particular language it had been teaching her for 10 years. The dogs were with her, old now, slower on the slope but still faithful. She stopped at the place where the first trees had been planted, the oldest ones, the originals from those wooden crates that had smelled of damp sawdust and hope. Their trunks were thick now, beginning to develop that beautiful gnarled quality that old olive trees have, the wood twisted in long patient spirals as if the tree is slowly wringing something out of itself and finding it good. She put both hands on the nearest trunk the way she sometimes did, not thinking anything in particular, just present. The bark was warm from the morning sun. Beneath her feet the rocky soil of Breeden Ridge held all its old character, the drainage and the depth and the memory of everything that had grown there and everything that hadn't, and everything that had almost not been given the chance. She stood there a while. The bees were already working in the rows behind her. The light was full and slanted and the leaves were doing what they do, turning in the small wind, silver to green to silver again, the way they'd done every morning for 10 years, the way they would do for 100 more years if the land was treated rightly. A worthless hill, Roy had called it. She understood him. She had loved him. She had also been right, and she held that knowledge not with triumph but with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had listened to something most people couldn't hear and had been patient enough to let it be proven true in its own time. The land had spoken. She had listened. Everything else had followed from that simple original act of attention. She walked back down the hill to make breakfast. The harvest that fall was the best they'd had. 68 degrees average through September, cool nights, no early freeze, the fruit. "It doesn't look like Kentucky," his wife said. "It looks like Harlan County," Edna said. "That's what Harlan County looks like when you let it be what it wants to be." The oil that year, when Dimitri pressed it and handed her the tasting glass at the mill in North Carolina, was the best she had made. She could taste the difference herself now, could read the oil the way you learn to read the land, with the whole body, not just the mind. The flavor was complex and long and real, the pepper finishing clean and strong, the fruitiness riding underneath like a note held on the left hand of a piano, and it tasted, she thought, like the hill smelled on a warm afternoon. Like dried herbs and old stone and deep honest soil. She drove home through the mountains with the new season's oil in the back of the truck and the windows down despite the October cold, and the air came in off the ridges smelling of leaf mold and wood smoke and the particular clean bitterness of autumn in the Cumberland Plateau, and she breathed it in and thought of nothing complicated. Just home. Just the hill. Just the long patient work of a woman who had put her hands in the right soil and waited for it to answer. It had answered. It had been answering for years.